Welcome to this lecture on the history of the province in South Africa in which you will be working, both digitally and hopefully physically. The reason why I'm presenting this lecture is because this is a very special province. It is very special as it is very complex and, as we will discover, very contested. And because of this, it holds a special place in my heart. However, in order that I'm correctly positioned in this discussion, I need to let you know who and why I am. I am presenting this from a specific position. I am a long-time resident of the province and as such have carried out much work in the architectural, heritage and anthropological fields. I started my studies in architecture at the time in which the 40-year-old apartheid regime was slowly being dismantled, and by the time we had our first democratic elections, I was working for the Built Environment Support Group, a non-governmental organisation which assisted communities in rural and urban areas solve their immediate built environment concerns, specifically with respect to upgrading housing, providing some community facilities, and helping with different types of advocacy and capacity building. Prior to the elections, the Built Environment Support Group was funded by many overseas organisations such as Oxfam and Rooftops Canada, and this international NGO money dried up once it was perceived that with a new dispensation, which was democratic, these responsibilities would be part of the new government's ambit. Much of the issues in today's political and social climate are due to this not having happened. For a variety of complex reasons common with many other new developing countries, such as corruption, repurposed priorities such as housing and health, and a wildly swelling built environment due to massive amounts of rural-urban movement supported by the post-apartheid neoliberal environment and the need by all to have access to jobs which earned people money. This was particularly important on the cusp of democracy, which, as you all know, was in 1994. Some devastating floods in recent years, in addition to rapid rural to urban movement after the retraction of the group areas legislation, meant that people flooded into urban areas, sitting on the peripheries of towns, and also landing in forgotten spaces on semi-abandoned lands. Importantly, these settlements, pejoratively considered as squatter camps, and now more broadly considered as informal settlements, terminology that I continue to have an issue with. Interestingly, and in retrospect I suppose, I've subsequently learnt that the ways in which we engaged with community projects whilst I was a student were considered as bottom-up, grassroots, or community capacity building, which was a whole bunch of words which constituted what is now development speak, and formed the basis of development theories coming out of the postmodern movement and the need for broadened ontologies, as well as informing much of the move towards the adoption of social sustainability as the third pillar of sustainability, which came out of a conference in Johannesburg in 2002. The reason why I'm saying this is to convey to you the immediate background to the current housing crisis and also contextualize the type of approach to community development, another phrase that I detest, that is useful in these post-colonial situations. When I studied architecture, the school in Durban was progressive and anti-government, stroke pro-democracy. We cut our teeth on real responses to real situations, making buildings out of gumpoles and mud, and working with locally sourced materials, incorporating water tanks, waterless toilets, and myriad other solutions to working in communities which had no access to any services. I realize now that this was a mixture of a modernist approach with a regionalist focus and some development-driven social awareness pedagogy, but also that this was quite an unusual form of architectural education. There was also an experimental project called the University of Natal Appropriate Technology Housing Unit, also known as UNATU, which had been purpose-built. These were experimental buildings on the lower fields of the campus, and this was where thermal and weathering experiments were carried out. The short monologue, A Short History of Besg, relates that UNATU came to a sticky end after this, as there were a lot of houses on site, and a number of hippies began moving into these houses. The university administration stated that this was aiding and abetting squatters, and by 1992, due to these problems, UNATU fizzled out. I laughed like a drain reading this, as the hippies that were living in these houses as squatters included architectural students who were studying with me. So, by means of introduction, I just want to give you some rough idea as to what's going to pop up in this lecture. The first thing is that I'm going to be looking at the pre-colonial period and the run-up to Union, and this is going to look at some really, really deep history, little bits of probably which you are aware of, but I think contextualizes where we are in terms of the world, but also in terms of this incredibly long history within which KwaZulu-Natal sits as a territory. It will then look at the Union period, which is the period after 1910, and then up to Republic through the 1960s and up to 1994 when we had our first democratic election. And this is really looking at South Africa in the post-colonial period, but in the pre-democratic period. So it's those 84 years of quite a critical series of contestations, not necessarily between black and white, but between white and white as well, which gives you some sort of sense as to this very slippery nature of the political and social landscape. And then it'll have a very brief section right at the end speaking briefly about the stresses and the strifes and the contestations of a new nation, and the fact that even though we've got one of the most advanced and most democratic constitutions in the world, it is an incredibly difficult place in order to be able to negotiate how this works, because everything is just so incredibly complex. So this lecture may help you with understanding the complex land history of KwaZulu-Natal province, and it's not only land history in terms of attachment to land, but in terms of how land can exist in terms of history, but how in terms of society it works in a completely different way. And it'll help you to understand the highly contested nature of land and land occupation in the province itself. And especially when you do come to understanding that there are these places called tribal trusts or Ingonyama, you will understand that there's a whole legal thing which makes them quite different. And this is because of their incredibly deep history. And you will also realize that the number of genetic and ethnic threads that enrich us and make us very interesting indeed, and also make us incredibly complex in KwaZulu-Natal, is something which is part of the richness that you will experience. And it should also help in understanding the context of colonial history, the relationship between South Africa and the world, and also the rise of exclusionary legislation, which form what was known as apartheid. So there's some things that I'd like you to note here, and these are actually quite important. So apartheid was a collection of exclusionary legislation. It was a collection. There is no such thing as the apartheid government. It is more correctly the nationalist government who ramped up exclusionary legislation after they came to power in 1948. So apartheid is a notion, and it's a set of policies which were underpinned by specific laws. The pre-colonial period in Natal or KwaZulu-Natal is a time prior to the arrival of the first white traders, around 1824. And the colonial period is between, strictly speaking, 1843, which is when Britain took over the annexation of Natal, and 1910, when South Africa went into union, and Natal basically lost its autonomy. The Union period is between 1910 and 1961, when South Africa became a republic. And just to remind you that South Africa is still a republic. However, it is a republic with a democratic government which was installed after the first democratic elections in 1994, and not a republic with the nuance of the nationalist period which existed before. And then it's also really important that I'll say some words and you'll probably be quite discomforted and say, but, shouldn't there be other ways of saying that? But I'd just like to put it out there that these things are also slippery slides. So the idea of Bushmen rather than San is something which has been popping up quite recently. San was a name which was a blanket nomenclature for for Bushmen type people, which was imposed on them shortly after the 1994 elections. And this was really about being able to give them a sense of identity within the different types of peoples which make up South Africa. But fundamentally, San itself, by many Bushman type people, is considered as being pejorative. And thus, when I refer to Bushmen, this is part of emerging scholarship which is beginning to interrogate the self-identity of people rather than an imposed identity, which actually is rather problematic. Natal refers to the period prior to 94 as Natal being as one of 4 provinces of South Africa. KwaZulu-Natal is the area after 1994 as one of 9 provinces of South Africa. So after 1994, there was a massive, great big demarcation commission, and we find that these provinces were repositioned and 5 new provinces were created in order to basically, I suppose, make territory a bit more egalitarian. I must just also point out that any words used in this lecture are not intended as pejorative. They may be used entirely in an historical context, and if I do use them, please think quite carefully as to what that particular context is. And then finally, there will be a couple of trigger warnings. So there are some uncomfortable conversations and there are some uncomfortable images. And I'd just like you to be aware of that before we launch into the rest of the lecture. Right, so when we're starting to talk about pre-colonial history, let's start at the very beginning. And this is in order to be able to ground you in the very long, deep history trajectory of where we come from, but also to get an understanding as to the absolute massive historical span that understanding anything in Africa begins with. So in South Africa particularly, what is really important is that particularly to the north of the country are those celebrated sites of early humans at what is known as the cradle of humankind. If you go to Sterkfontein, Swartkrans and Dreamwillen, for example, as well as Taung, which was on the Botswana border, you will be able to go and see some of the earliest sites of humanoid fossils, and particularly the sort of origins of what we began as people. So we really are in Africa amongst the ancestors. In KwaZulu-Natal particularly, 2 specifically eminent sites are those found at Border Cave and Sibudu. Both are largely Middle Stone Age sites, and Border Cave is particularly important because it's got a continuous record of occupation which goes over 120,000 to perhaps 200,000 years. And there is almost complete skeleton of a child around 82,000 years old, and this is seen as a ritual burial. And this particular event pushed back dates of San, Bushman, hunter-gatherer culture. At the same time, 44,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Border Cave were using digging sticks weighted with perforated stones. They wore ostrich egg and marine shell beads, and they used notched bones for notational purposes. They shaped bone points for use as awls, and these are used for leatherworking, and also poisoned arrowheads, just as modern Bushmen do today. And these were used in order to be able to make arrows to glue together arrows that could be thrown. At Sibudu Cave, there is also evidence of some of the earliest examples of modern human technology, the earliest bone arrow of 61,000 years old, the earliest needle of 61,000 years old, the earliest use of heat-treated mixed compound gluing of 72,000 years ago, and the earliest example of the use of bedding, and this was 67,000 years ago, but I believe that subsequently this has been pushed back even earlier. And what this does is it positions human beings as cogent people who are planning ahead and working out their lives. If we look at the lifeways of pre-colonial societies, we look at hunter-gatherer societies, and for that, around the world, we've got examples of the Bushmen in South Africa. We've got the examples of the Inuit in northern parts of the United States, for example. The Apache, I think, would be considered as hunter-gatherer societies. So hunter-gatherer societies are people who will work off lifeways of hunting and gathering in order to be able to provide for their well-being. Then there are also pastoralist societies, and pastoralist societies are those who rely largely on animal keeping. And so, for example, pastoralist societies in South Africa would be considered the Nama. If we look at people like the Maasai in Kenya, they would be considered pastoralists. And to large degree, Zulu people, in terms of a conceptual idea of lifestyle, could be considered as pastoralist. Then we can also look at societies based on trade. And I mean, societies based on trade are found all around the world, but certainly societies based on trade are found particularly in the more central parts of southern Africa, or the more central parts of the southern parts of Africa. And these are societies in which power and stratification is basically ordered because of access to goods, but also access to the vehicles of being able to get goods. So that's either rivers or roads. And then we get particularly characteristic in southern Africa as very mixed lifeways, largely between hunter-gatherer, pastoralism, and agrarians, who are the people who plant crops. So the mixed lifeways is something which you'll probably experience quite a lot of, is working between the ancestral keeping of cattle and the purpose of cattle in society, as well as a very long history, or relatively long history, of growing crops to as subsistence. So hunter-gatherer societies, we have examples of the Bushmen, and this image here shows the rudimentary shelters that are constructed by them, which are known as skerms, and these are literally built for purpose. They're built for the amount of time that people need to settle in one place, and then they're going to move on. Then we look at pastoralist societies, and these images are looking at the people, the Nama people, or the Khoi people who were resident in the Cape when the early settlers arrived from about the 17th century onwards. And you can see here images of the Khoi who were pastoralists, literally putting their buildings together and using mats to cover them. So these are building materials and building forms which were essentially pastoralist, and people could put the materials and the components of these different buildings onto the backs of animals when they moved from place to place. And typically, in the case of the Khoi, it would have been oxen. And then we look at mixed lifeways. And, with mixed lifeways, as I said, I think we're really looking specifically at the Zulu in this case, because as you noticed, or as you will find out when you get to KwaZulu-Natal, the mixture of the lifeway of cattle keeping, and this is exemplified in the image at the top there, showing what is called the central cattle pattern, which is very typical of the Zulu and of pastoralist people, in which the different hierarchical spaces within a homestead are arranged around a central cattle buyer. And you'll see there George Angus's very famous image of a Zulu homestead, which he probably drew in the sort of mid 19th century. So this gives you a central idea that the reliance on cattle keeping was really important, but at the same time, this did determine the centrality of the homestead. And if we start looking at people of these different lifeways coming into the southern parts of Africa, we know from oral histories, we know from archaeological histories that there was a southerly movement of Nguni people. When I've done work with the Hlubi, for example, they will talk very specifically about certain ancestors coming from the Congo, and they will speak about generations being in different places and significantly crossing the Crocodile River. So this idea of movement and the idea of mobility is really, really important in understanding the movement of people and the way in which the societies work in a very slippery and fluid way, particularly for the pre-colonial landscape of KwaZulu-Natal. So certainly Iron Age societies in KwaZulu-Natal are very characteristic. The making of iron, as in any society, gave people who could control the use of iron, gave them a specific cachet, but also gave them prominence in terms of being able to have access to materials which were really good for warfare, but also for tilling the soil. And so iron smelting was considered a special skill, and the smelting families were often considered pariahs. And some people, such as the Mbonambi people, for example, who were those people who smelted assegais for King Shaka, they were people who were considered to have these sort of otherworldly spirits about them. So the Iron Age in KwaZulu-Natal is dated between AD 450 and AD 1050, which is called the Early Iron Age, and the Late Iron Age was about 1050 to about 1820. So certainly when the first white settlers arrived in the port of Natal in around 1823, 1824, much of the entire region was working between the Late Iron Age and Stone Age technologies. And Iron Age sites are identified, and this also happens around Europe, for example, and America. Iron Age sites are identified and dated through specific ceramic types. So, for example, we'll have the Ndondondwan ceramics, which you can see drawings of the potsheds there, and Msaluzi, for example, is another type. And these really are diagnostic materials which tell us that the people who lived here lived in this particular era. Then we have societies based on trade. And really the societies based in trade were found much more further to the north of the country, particularly on the border of what is today South Africa and Zimbabwe, at the great junction of the Shasha and the Limpopo rivers. And not only is Mapungubwe and K2 and Schroeder, which are the three sites of specific importance in South Africa, but also Kami and Great Zimbabwe across the border situated in what is today's Zimbabwe as a country. These sites were all societies based on trade. And these sites based on trade are evidenced by very distinctive hierarchies in the architectural forms, but also hierarchies in terms of elevation within the settlements themselves. And we know that these were societies based on trade because of the different types of materials such as ceramics and beadwork, which is found connecting them very strongly to the Indian Ocean trade routes of the distant past. So more significantly, we've got Mapungubwe, K2 and Schroeder, and this complex is all situated on the Zimbabwean border, on the South African border with Zimbabwe, in a World Heritage Site. And this is particularly important because this is evidence of gold working prior to the arrival of white people. And this in itself is an entire political discussion. And so the politics of archaeology are really centered around the founding of the site in the 1930s. A farmer discovered some artifacts on his farm, and he called in the University of Pretoria, after which the site was excavated, and these particular artifacts were discovered, all of which proved to some sort of considered culture way before the arrival of white people. And one of the great big ideas of justifying colonization, both in the past and in the recent past, has been this idea of, oh well, when the white settlers arrived here, there was this land which was an empty land. This empty land discourse is something which really was part of the justification for white settlement. And so these artifacts really challenged the sort of nationalistic idea of terra nullius and access to an empty land. So early colonial structures, and here I'm talking about the structures brought in by the colonists, were through the Portuguese, who arrived with Bartholomew Dias in 1488. And note that this was 4 years before the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. And when Bartholomew Dias arrived, he stopped at what was known as the Cabo de Boa Esperança, and this is really known as the Cape of Good Hope. The Dutch arrived with Jan van Riebeck in 1652, in which the Cape was settled as a watering station en route to Dutch colonies in the east, such as Batavia. So actually the Cape at first had very, very little importance for anybody politically, because the more interesting places were much further along the route. But what is important is that there did become a series of contestations because the Dutch East India Company was using St. Helena as one of its main stopping spaces, and this really was one of the sort of big contestations for the settlement of the Cape, but also by the subsequent settlement of the Cape in 1805. So the English arrived permanently in the Cape in 1806, and this precipitated the massive movement of the Dutch farmers into the interior, known as the Great Trek, which happened much later, but it really was as a result of much deliberation and much pressure from the British colonials, sort of into the early years of the 19th century. Great. Now we get to Natal, more correctly contemporary KwaZulu-Natal, and this for me fundamentally is a story of three brothers. These three brothers really colour the landscape of the history of the province, and this is possibly because these three brothers were the people with whom the early settlers are engaged with from 1823, 1824 onwards. So the three brothers starts with this gentleman, Shaka Kasenzangakona. He was born illegitimately as the son of Senzangakona, who was the king or chief of a reasonably small clan at the time of the Zulu people, and they were situated in the central northern areas of the contemporary province. His despotic reign and his brutal demeanor, which is something which today would have certainly sent him to the International Criminal Court, are legendary. But at the same time, Shaka is responsible for being able to change warfare methods, change quite significant elements of traditional Zulu culture, as well as being able to assimilate most of the peoples within, or those that remained in, the colony of Natal as it became, under the umbrella term of Zulu. He was followed on, and importantly, Shaka was the king or the chief who was dominant at the time of the arrival of the traders in 1823, 1824. He was closely followed by his brother Dingaan, and Dingaan for me is quite fascinating because he was really between a rock and a hard place. He was a personality who, when I was growing up, was considered more brutal than Shaka because he'd murdered a whole bunch of trekkers, Boers, Afrikaner, or Dutch settlers at his homestead at Mapungubwe in 1838. But at the same time, my subsequent understanding of Dingaan is that he really was a very contested personality because he was sitting in the middle of inheriting a sort of whole bunch of people from disparate backgrounds from his brother's reign, but at the same time having to deal with not one, but two different types of settlers, i.e. the British and then also the Boers, the Dutch settlers. Dingaan was succeeded by another half-brother, Mpande, and Mpande is quite legendary because he was basically a half-brother that was allowed to live. He was really considered as being a bit of a weakling and a bit of a naff. And so nobody actually thought that he'd ever come to power. And ironically, Mpande's power lasted longer than any of his half-brothers who preceded him. So firstly, the next thing to understand is how Zulu society in pre-colonial and early colonial times worked. So we've got to think of this a bit like the ancient Greek states. If you think of ancient Greece, there was Corinth, which rose to prominence at certain times. There was Doros, which rose to prominence at certain times. There was Io, which rose to prominence at certain times. And the different fluxes and flows of these different city-states, as they were, is very much the same thing that happened in in the territory that is now KwaZulu-Natal. So if we look at the map below, we can see that there's a red line demarcating the area very specifically into northeast and southwest. And this red line is the very strong boundary provided by the Mzanyati or Buffalo stroke Tugela rivers. And this strong boundary is really important because the strong boundary was a natural break between what became the territory of Zululand to the northeast and the territory of Natal to the southwest. What is also important is that the boundaries that I've put in there, i.e. Swaziland, now Eswatini, Transvaal, now partly in Mpumalanga and Gauteng, and Transkei to the southwest, these are all archaic names, but they are names of territories which existed for most of the 20th century. So they're there in order to locate the sort of more modern histories of the particular province. So the important thing to know is that if we look at the position of Zulu, and that's that sort of single circle to the north between Nongoma and Ulundi, that was really the sort of hotbed, the place where Shaka built up his homesteads. The first two homesteads were KwaBulawayo 1, the second homestead was KwaBulawayo 2, and the third homestead, not surprisingly, was KwaBulawayo 3. And these separate homesteads all moved closer and closer to the epicenter of the Zulu territory. What the other images show, or the other circles show, is the movement of people such as the Hlubi to the north and the Mkhize to the south. And both of these were people who were situated archaically in the north in Zulu territory, but between 1818 and 1888, these particular groups of people were forced to move across the Tugela-Mzanyati border and seek refuge in Natal. This particular movement is not unusual to the Hlubi and the Mkhize. Many other groups of people fled Zululand between 1818 and 1888, and this is even reckoned prior to 1818 in what is a phenomenon known as Mfecane. Mfecane really is an umbrella term for this massive people movement from the Zululand area far south to the province, some of the people moving into the former Transkei, which would have been the Cape in those days, but also moving far north. People scattered across northern areas of what is today Mpumalanga, Gauteng, Limpopo. Some people even went to Zimbabwe, the contemporary Zimbabwe, and some people even went north to Malawi. And the phenomenon of the Mfecane was blamed originally on Shaka, but certainly it is possibly attributed to much more, a much greater sort of set of ideas, such as Julian Cobbing suggested in the 1980s, slaving south from Maputo, but also landscape changes, environmental resources, etc. And certainly the flux and flow of the build-up of these different city-states as they were was very much an environmental movement. So at one stage the Zulu would dominate, at other stages the Ndwandwe would dominate, at other times the Buthelezi would dominate, and this movement of backwards and forwards, connection with land and movement of land was something which is very characteristically part of the 19th century landscape. And pre-19th century, certainly. So it's really important to understand the historic contestation of land in order to perhaps put it into your mind as to what the actual implications of this are for today. So the Mfecane really was a phenomenon of massive people movement. It could be attributed to all sorts of things, but traditionally it has been attributed to Shaka. And certainly the movement of people such as the Mthembu and the Mchunu as early as 1822 and 1823 from the north across the Tugela-Mzanyati border into the southern regions of what is today KwaZulu-Natal. These really were quite important in establishing what is considered as being an empty territory theory, which was very much part of the defense of settlers who arrived in Port Natal in 1823, 1824, but also for much of the 20th century, part of the defense of the nationalist government in being able to justify white control of land. So we've spoken about Shaka Kasenza Ngakona. He is legendary and certainly is attributed to being able to consolidate a whole bunch of different tribal groups underneath his rule between 1818 and 1828 when he died. It's also important to know that Shaka was the person who was in power at the time of the arrival of the first white traders. And these guys arrived, about 6 or 8 of them, I can't quite remember. These guys arrived in 1823, 1824 to trade. They were really, really interested in being able to get access to particularly ivory and skins, but also there are mutterings that perhaps they had some interests in the slave trade as well. And this, of course, was way before the outlaw of trade in about the mid-1830s, slave trade in about the mid-1830s. But certainly these traders went and met with Shaka, and they were, according to David Hedges, very happily accepted by him because they had all these really interesting things, such as Western medicaments and cloth particularly, which gave him power because he had unusual goods. And so the original treaties of trade signed between the group of traders and Shaka was that the traders were allowed to occupy a portion of land in the territory south of the Tugela and the Umzanyati rivers, which they subsequently called Port Natal. And this allocation or cessation of land was on the condition that they traded only with him so that he could retain power over these unusual goods. So it's really important to also understand that the first part of the so-called colonial era between 1823, 1824 and 1843 was actually a whole bunch of random guys who were basically traders affiliated with a trading warehouse in Cape